Reading. I mean, reading to me is absolutely, it comes first. To me, it's the other side of writing. If you don't read, you can't write. And it troubles me that many people want to write and publish before having read a lot and before knowing what they like to read, to be able to then copy in a good way. Yeah. What they are, you know, their intentions. I don't do creative writing classes, but when they ask me, I always tend to say, try to start writing what you like. Like if you like thrillers, start with thrillers. And the reason is because you read a lot of thrillers, so you kind of know the mechanism. And then you can experiment, and then you can find your voice, but first is kind of... And I wrote my first novel when I was 17. I started writing it, and of course I was copying the writers I loved. I loved Anne Rice, I loved William Burroughs, I loved Bret Easton Ellis, you know, all that generation. Between fantasy, romantic, gothic, and urban, gritty realism, and somehow. And you can tell that it's a very youth novel.
Yeah? Why?
Because those influences are very, I mean, I like influences and I like influences to be shown in the work. But in this novel are very upfront. Because I didn't really have a voice. I was 17, it's not that I didn't really have a voice because I didn't know, you know, what are you going to say at 17? There is a limit of your experience and of your reading too. So it takes time. I'm glad that I mean, I had many trouble with being so young in my first novel, but I think I learned a lot, especially of how it takes time, and you can see how you grow as a writer.
Well, it's kind of shocking, but I have never done a single class ever in how to write creatively. I did my undergrad degree at university way back 23 years ago in fiction, so looking at literature, but not writing it. And then when I was 25, I just I had this urge to begin writing stories, and so I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know any writers, I had no community, and I just started to experiment. And I think for me, the most important thing was being a big reader. So I'd been reading enormous amounts of novels and short stories for years. So I just instinctively wrote the kind of stories that I would want to read. And they were terrible at the start, like really, really awful. But I kept at it. And after about 3 years of writing for 2 hours every day, I had work that I felt comfortable sending out to be published. And I think at that stage, that's when I began to find other writers and a community and people to swap ideas and work with. But it was quite late in the game for me.
I guess I learned how stories work from absorbing stories in every possible medium.
Yeah.
My first memory of being told a story was through comic strips, bande dessinée.
Yeah.
I used to get comics delivered to my home when I was a kid. Every Friday, this little magazine would arrive, and I'd.
Well, I didn't really, because especially this book here, the Château de Cartes, it has a lot of journalistic stories that were not publishable. I could not publish them. Some because I didn't have enough matter of facts to publish it, others because no one wanted to publish them because they were very critical. Just to have an idea, I worked for an economic magazine, and I wrote about a banker, a Portuguese banker who was known as the owner of everything because he was so powerful, and he didn't like my article, so the magazine was closed. And that didn't only happen to me, it happened to other colleagues of me too. And nowadays the guy has been sentenced to a jail term because he is a crook. And I wrote that he was a crook, but at that time he was not a crook yet, he was still a very influential person. And that kind of stories that you cannot write as a journalist, unfortunately there are many of them, also in Western democracy, There are lots of them. So I took them, put them together in a bowl, stirred it, and made a polar.
You know, cartoons, kids stuff.
Yeah.
So the stories would be very simple. They would be one page, told mainly in images, and I think that gave me a very clear grasp very early on of what the shape of stories can look like. Because, you know, to draw those things and to write those things, even though it was just silly, funny stories for kids, there's an art, there's a craftsmanship to it. And then I started reading the classic books that children read in Britain, Enid Blyton, Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, fantasy books, this kind of thing. But also I started watching movies, not in the cinema so much, but on TV, because we had a lot of old movies shown on television back in the 60s and 70s. So that gave me an introduction to classic Hollywood storytelling, where the story arc and the 3-act structure is very clear. And then it wasn't until I was 16 or 17 that I started reading serious books, but I'd learned a lot of the fundamentals of storytelling by then, I think, from these other places. Television as well.
Because when I was young, I thought that, for example, there's many things, but one that I think is very important and very, like a good example of what happens. I thought that, for example, writing in a female narrator voice was very easy, because I identify myself as a woman. And then when I started writing, not only the women were totally awful and not, not real in a way. They were very wooden, but they spoke like me, like Mariana, not like a character. It was not a female narrator voice, it was my voice. And I was a kind of surprise. It was like, but I thought it was essential. And I learned that nothing is essential, that you have to find a voice if you want to write about the dog, if you want to write about yourself even. You have to construct a character. That if you want to write something, a female character, you have to construct a female character. But when I started, I thought, if you have certain experience, you can write about that experience, but it's not like that. Literature is not a reflection of reality at all, even when you do realism. But when I began, I think I thought, and that it was like that, and I started finding problems.
I think, like a lot of writers, I began by imitating my favourite writers.
Yeah.
When I was very young, I was writing stories that were like Sherlock Holmes or James Bond or the other kinds of things I was reading, and then I became interested in humour and irony, and I started imitating British comic writers like David Lodge and Kingsley Amis, and then Flann O'Brien. So everything I wrote until I was 20 was really an imitation of somebody else. And then I've still got many of these manuscripts, and you can see my own voice and my own style gradually beginning to enter and take over.
Yeah.
So you pass from imitation to being influenced, which is a different thing.
And making mistakes as well. Yeah.
Exactly.
I mean, I think people always ask you how many books have you written, and how many books have you written is very different from how many books have you published. Published 7 books, I've written at least 14.
Good to hear.
I'm desperately trying to write a young adult novel. I've just sent one off this weekend. That's my 4th attempt at writing an entire 60,000 word novel, and the first 3 attempts got rejected, and they should have, because they were terrible. But I learned something from each one, and I think, hopefully, fingers crossed, the 4th one might make it over the line. But I don't think that's what beginner writers want to hear, that it might take, that's basically a year's worth of work that never came to anything. But I don't think it was a waste, because I learned going back of what went wrong there. Why did that not work? The voice wasn't right, the plot was too thin. There, you know, you learn stuff from all your mistakes.